This video is going to be looking at section B of your core studies exam, or at least part of section B. So within section B, you're going to encounter the issues and the debates. Okay, now the issues relate to important factors that we must consider when we are conducting psychological research. When it comes to the issues, it essentially means that you need to gain an understanding of all these factors we must consider, why people sometimes don't consider them, the consequences of not considering them, or why some people will consider the issue but go ahead with the research anyway, and again what the consequences of that are. With the debates are essentially arguments within psychology, so they represent two semantically different ideas or viewpoints in psychology. And these viewpoints relate to the way that we try to understand and explain human behaviour. Now, both of the viewpoints within the debate have their own strengths, their own weaknesses, but what you need to be able to understand is how each of the studies that you've looked at and each of the areas that we will look at in the course relate to either side of these debates. Now, within a debate you can take one side or you can take the other, or sometimes you might be what you call interactionist, so you might look at being kind of on a sliding scale between the two sides of the debate. Okay, so you have to be able to discuss these debates, so look at the strengths and the weaknesses of each side of the debates. You also need to be able to discuss how the debates and the issues link with one another or are different from one another. So you need to be able to be confident in presenting these arguments that detail these different kind of positions within the debate, and using research to illustrate those different positions, and also being able to evaluate holding that position. So we'll look at some debates first. So the first debate is the Reductionism-Holism debate. So these are opposites from each other, reductionism and holism. Reductionism is where psychologists attempt to break down behaviour into its constituent parts. Okay, so taking a reductionist viewpoint means breaking something down into its individual parts and looking at these behaviours one at a time. But please make sure that you are aware that reductionism is not just looking at a single factor. Reductionism is breaking behaviour down and simplifying it into its constituent parts. So if you think about experiments, if you break behaviours down to establish an IV, an independent variable, a dependent variable, and lots of extraneous variables that you're going to try and hold some element of control over, that would be part of a reductionist viewpoint, because you're breaking down complex behaviours into simplistic parts. Okay? Holism is the opposing view. So a holistic approach sees human behaviour as too complex to be reduced down to single explanations. So human beings are seen as more than the sum of these individual parts. We are seen as a whole. Okay? So it focuses on the whole. This means that it's difficult to make predictions about behaviour, because you're not just looking at individual parts of a complex behaviour that are broken down, but you're looking at how there are many different factors that can contribute to a behaviour and how they can work together and influence a behaviour, and then this can become a bit complicated when it comes to trying to make these predictions. Okay, so reductionism, breaking behaviour down to constituent parts, and holism is seeing human behaviour as more than the sum of individual parts, but as a whole. The next of the debates is Determinism and Freewill. So again, these are semantically opposite from each other. The idea of free will is that human beings are entirely free to act as they choose and bear responsibility for the outcome of their behaviour. Okay? So this would mean that if your behaviour is due to free will, then when you are presented with choices and decisions, that you have conscious control over the choices and the decisions that you are making. Okay. Now, the opposing view is determinism. So determinism suggests that we lack control of our behaviour and we are controlled by determining factors such as genes, past experiences, people within the environment, for example. Okay, so a deterministic view would suggest that you have no conscious control over your behaviour. Okay, so this is one of those debates where you have those hard determinism views and free will views, but you can also have something called soft determinism. So soft determinism is the idea that while you are able to exercise some element of free will, this free will is often constrained by other factors. So you're still exhibiting some element of determinism. For example, it might be that you're more likely to exhibit depressive behaviours because of your genetic makeup or your brain structures, but actually you've got free will and some element of control over your own behaviour and whether you show these features or not. And that's known as soft determinism. Okay, so the next debate is the nature or nurture debate. Okay, this one is one that most people are fairly familiar with. So the nature debate sees biological factors as the explanation for thinking and behaviour. Now, these could be biological factors such as genetics or hormones or brain structures, or they could be factors which you would consider to be innate. So if you go through a set of predetermined stages, if you experience those stages that are predetermined, then that's innate, that's nature. Okay. The opposing view, which is nurture, sees behaviour as being learned or acquired through experiences and through the environment. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward as a debate. Okay, now the last of the debates that we're going to look at is the individual or situational debate. Now this debate has two very clear sides, okay? So the individual side of the debate suggests that you look to the person as the cause of the behaviour, specifically their personality or their disposition. So it's kind of like individual, internal factors that specifically relate to you that are the root of your behaviour, thoughts or attitudes. If you look at the situational side of the debate, this draws upon the circumstances around an individual. For example, how your social group or your upbringing has influenced your behaviour, your thoughts or your attitudes. Okay, so if often you're determined to be kind of responsible for your own behaviour, then it's usually kind of an individual explanation. So if it's something specifically about you that has meant you behaved in that particular way, it's individual. However, if you're often deemed to kind of not be responsible because it's something within your environment or the context or the situation that you're in has demanded a particular behaviour, then it's situational. Okay, so that's it for your debates. Now we have a series of issues which are also important to consider. Okay, this should contain some words and pieces of terminology that you're fairly familiar with. So you've got the psychology as a science issue. Now this relates to the consideration of whether we should class psychology as a science or not. Okay, now there's lots of considerations within this. There's lots of factors which will deem whether a piece of research is scientific or not, and you should be fairly familiar with some of these. So cause and effect. Do we establish a causal link between two variables? Is one responsible for the other? Falsification, which is the idea that you're able to demonstrate that something is not the case. You have the opportunity to prove a hypothesis as being false. Replicability, so being able to repeat the original procedure in the exact same way to establish some element of reliability. Induction. Now, induction is a scientific method that uses these kind of very general observations to generate hypotheses and then develop a theory. Having some element of control over extraneous variables. Testing hypotheses. So you try and gain some scientific evidence by creating a hypothesis or a prediction and then doing a piece of research to either prove or disprove it. Manipulation of variables, so manipulating an independent variable to see if it causes a change in a dependent variable. Deduction, which we know is another process of scientific inquiry, so it develops hypotheses from theories and then tests these. So this is more like having a theory, developing a hypothesis and testing it, so kind of the opposite way to induction. Objectivity, so if you're being objective, you take an unbiased external perspective, so it's not affected by any bias or personal viewpoints. Having quantifiable measures, so you're using quantitative data when you're measuring your dependent variable. And lastly, standardisation, so using set procedures that are kept the same for all your participants. Now, essentially, these pieces of terminology are important because we're saying that if you qualify for some of these considerations, then your piece of research is scientific. So this is an issue in psychology because some people believe that we should be quite scientific, whereas other researchers suggest that actually we should not necessarily conform to the rules of science, and that sometimes the rules of science are not helpful in trying to understand behaviour. So you need to be able to understand why. Another issue is conducting socially sensitive research. Okay, so whether we should conduct socially sensitive research or not. Okay. Now, socially sensitive research is research which could create a negative impact upon a group within society. So if it kind of causes some controversy, or it stigmatises a certain group, or it could create some kind of prejudice or discrimination, or even if there's any risk of any of those things happening, or if it could be interpreted in a negative or different way by people within society, or it could be used, if it is interpreted in the incorrect way, if it does create a stigma, if it can be used to kind of, negatively change things in society, then it can be classed as being socially sensitive. Now, this issue is concerned with the impact that research can have with the population that we're trying to generalise to, rather than the sample. Now, this issue considers whether we should do research if it could cause offence or it could cause harm, or whether we should steer clear of doing that research. So when you're deciding whether to conduct socially sensitive research or not, you need to include considerations such as, a group or individual may experience shame or exclusion if we talk about a sensitive issue, or if it's going to have a negative implication for government policy or change people's lives in a negative way, then it could be socially sensitive. So some researchers say that we should do this socially sensitive research because it's still important, and others would prefer if we steered clear from it. Ethics. So ethical considerations is another issue. Okay. Now we've already talked about ethics as part of the course, but ethics essentially are the values of a particular group and relate to morals, so what you can do and what you can't do with participants. Now, Some pieces of research are praised for being very, very ethical. Some are criticised for being very unethical, and therefore the question arises as to, under what circumstances can we use unethical practices? So we have to weigh up this decision when we are conducting research, so that is why it is an issue in psychology. And obviously there are reasons for conducting unethical research and reasons against. This is your last issue, okay? Now this is concerned with the usefulness of research, so whether or not research is useful both inside and outside of psychology. Now, the idea is that obviously we want research to be useful. Ways in which research can be useful is, firstly, if it adds to our knowledge and can be applied to real world situations, then it can be considered useful. So for example, if you can develop a therapy from it, or a questioning technique, or a revision technique, or you can use it to train people in how to do something, or you can reduce feelings of helplessness about a certain issue in psychology, then all of this would be considered useful. However, sometimes a piece of research may lack credibility, and it's therefore difficult to apply outside a particular piece of research. So again, it's looking at the issue of factors which can make research more useful or less useful.